At 9:14 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in September, HOA President Sandra Whitfield made the single most catastrophic mistake of her 54 years on this earth. She raised her perfectly manicured hand French tips, obviously, because women like Sandra always have French tips, and slapped a retired United States Army colonel across the face on his own private property in front of 3 witnesses, 2 security cameras, and 1 very patient sheriff who had been waiting for exactly this moment for 6 long weeks. The sound of that slap cracked through the quiet suburban morning like a rifle shot. Birds scattered from the oak tree my grandfather planted in 1963. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips across the street. Even Sandra's own shadow seemed to flinch at what she had just done. What Sandra didn't know in that moment, what she couldn't have known, because she had spent so many years inside her own suffocating bubble of entitlement that reality had become. A foreign country she had stopped visiting entirely was that the tall, quiet man standing exactly 2 feet behind Colonel James Harrison was Sheriff Raymond Cole, 31-year veteran of law enforcement. The man who had personally arrested 4 sitting state officials for corruption in the past decade alone. A man who had seen every variety of human stupidity imaginable and had somehow never lost his capacity to be mildly surprised by new varieties. And every single second of what Sandra Whitfield just did was being recorded on 3 separate cameras. Sandra's French tips were still tingling when she heard the 6 words that would echo in her memory for the rest of her natural life. "Ma'am, please put your hands back." Sheriff Cole's voice carried that particular quality of calm that only develops in men who have spent 30 years being the most dangerous person in any room they enter. Not aggressive, not excited, simply inevitable. The voice of consequence arriving exactly on schedule. The color drained from Sandra Whitfield's face like someone had pulled a plug from a bathtub. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. The words she had been preparing, the righteous indignation, the HOA bylaw citations, the references to her husband's position on the city council, all of it evaporated in the September morning air like dew burning off grass. 30 seconds. That's all it took? 30 seconds between the slap heard across Maplewood Estates and the click of handcuffs around Sandra Whitfield's French-tipped wrists. Drop a flag emoji in the comments right now and tell me where you're watching from. Because what Sandra started that September morning didn't end with her arrest. It ended with federal charges, a disgraced husband, a neighborhood breathing free for the first time in 6 years, and a story that eventually landed in front of a congressional subcommittee on HOA reform. Stay with me. This goes so much deeper than one slap. My name is Colonel James Harrison, retired, 58 years old, 26 years in the United States Army, most of them in places that still don't appear on unclassified maps. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, 1 deployment I'm still not entirely at liberty to discuss in specific terms, except to say that it involved a lot of sand, very little sleep, and decisions that still visit me occasionally at 3 in the morning. I've been shot at by people who genuinely knew what they were doing. I've negotiated with men who considered human life a bargaining chip. I've made decisions in the dark with incomplete information that determined whether soldiers went home to their families or didn't. I've carried the specific gravity of command for 2 decades and come out the other side with my integrity intact, my lower back significantly less intact, and a deep, permanent, almost religious appreciation for peace and quiet. So when I finally retired and came home to my grandfather's house in Maplewood Estates, peace and quiet was the entire plan. That and maybe finally getting around to fixing the back porch railing I'd been promising myself since 2019. My grandfather, William Harrison Big Will, everybody called him, bought the house in 1961 for $11,000 cash, which in 1961 represented about 4 years of careful saving for a man who worked at the textile plant 6 days a week and never once complained about it. Solid brick construction. Wide front porch with columns. Big Will poured himself over 1 long summer weekend with his brother Raymond and 2 cases of cold beer. A backyard deep enough for the vegetable garden my grandmother tended with the kind of devotion other women reserve for religion. An American flag on a steel pole that had been flying since November 22, 1963, the day President Kennedy was shot, because Big Will said a country needed its flag most when things were darkest. The house smelled like Old Spice and motor oil and 60 years of honest living. Every room held a specific memory. The kitchen where my grandmother taught me to make biscuits from scratch at age 7. The back bedroom where I slept every summer of my childhood under a ceiling fan that wobbled slightly on its axis and made a sound like a slow heartbeat. The garage where Big Will first put a wrench in my hand and said, "Boy, a man who can't fix his own things is a man at the mercy of the world." When Big Will passed 4 years ago, the house came to me, his only grandson. The one who'd come back between every deployment to mow the lawn and clean the gutters and sit on the porch with him, drinking sweet tea and listening to him talk about the neighborhood the way it used to be. He'd outlived my parents' car accident when I was 11, and in a lot of ways he'd outlived everything except the house and the flag and the stories he kept stored carefully in that old mind of his. His last coherent week, his hand was thin and papery, but his grip was still surprisingly firm when he held mine. "Ghost," he said, using the nickname that had followed me from childhood through 2 decades of military service. "That house has been in our family for 60 years. Don't let anybody take it. Not with money, not with paper, not with fancy words and legal nonsense. You stand your ground." I promised him I would. I had no idea at the time exactly how literal that promise was going to become. The house needed work when I moved in full-time. Years of back and forth between assignments had meant deferred maintenance that had accumulated quietly like interest on a debt. Gutters needed cleaning. The driveway had 2 cracks that were slowly merging into one ambitious crack. The beautiful cedar fence Big Will had built by hand along the left side of the property in 1987 straight, as solid as the man himself, needed 2 new boards replaced at the far end, where weather had gotten into the grain. I threw myself into the work. Physical labor after decades of military. Service is its own particular therapy. There's something deeply satisfying about fixing something with your hands, about a clear before and after, about a problem with an actual solution you can hold and measure. After years of managing problems that had no clean solutions and consequences that echoed for decades, the simple geometry of home repair felt like a gift. The neighbors were good people. Tom and Rita Kowalski next door, married 43 years, who brought over a casserole my first week back and checked on me with a frequency that felt maternal in the best possible way. Eleanor Patterson across the street, 81 years old, sharp as a tack, who had known Big Will since 1964 and told me stories about him I'd never heard. Marcus and Diane Washington, 2 houses down, who had a teenage son named Andre that reminded me painfully of myself at that age, quiet, watchful, absorbing everything. These were good people living good lives in a neighborhood that had been genuinely pleasant for most of 6 decades. And then there was Sandra Whitfield. Sandra had moved to Maplewood Estates 7 years ago with her husband David, who had recently won a seat on the city council on a platform of community investment and transparent governance, 2 concepts he had subsequently treated as purely theoretical. Within 8 months of arriving, Sandra had maneuvered herself onto the HOA board. Within 14 months, she had engineered the removal of the previous president, a retired schoolteacher named Frank Mobley, who made the fatal mistake of questioning Sandra's first proposed budget. Within 18 months, Sandra was president, treasurer, and the effective dictator of a neighborhood that had previously governed itself with approximately the same level of drama as a church bake sale. She drove a pearl white Range Rover with personalized plates that read Standard, which she considered clever and the rest of the neighborhood considered ominous. She wore blazers in colors that somehow all managed to communicate aggression: cobalt blue, hard red, the particular shade of gray that says I have already decided I am right. She had the kind of posture that suggested she had been personally appointed by God to enforce proper fence heights, and she took this responsibility extremely seriously. Sandra's vision for Maplewood Estates was what she called an upscale unified community aesthetic, which translated in practice to a neighborhood that looked like a catalog for a home goods company that catered exclusively to people who considered beige a bold choice. Every fence had to meet new height specifications. Every mailbox had to be an approved style from an approved vendor who, as it later turned out, was her brother-in-law. Every driveway had to be free of what she termed commercial or industrial vehicles, a category she interpreted with breathtaking creative latitude. The violations started small. A citation for my truck, a perfectly maintained F-250 that I'd owned for 11 years, being classified as a commercial vehicle because it had a toolbox mounted in the bed. A notice about my flagpole being 4 inches taller than the newly revised acceptable height. A letter about the color of my front door, which had been the same shade of deep navy since Big Will painted it in 1994, and which Sandra's newly constituted aesthetic committee had determined did not align with community standards. I did what any reasonable person would do. I wrote back, politely. I cited the original HOA covenants signed when Big Will joined in 1989, which contained no provision about flagpole heights, no commercial vehicle restrictions, and a front door color guideline that listed navy blue as explicitly acceptable. I included page numbers. I included photocopies. I was, if I'm being honest, almost aggressively reasonable about the whole thing. Because 26 years of military service teaches you that documentation wins more battles than aggression. Sandra's response to my documentation was to issue 2 more violations. That's when I understood I wasn't dealing with a misguided administrator. I was dealing with someone who had confused a homeowners association with a personal fiefdom and had been operating without meaningful opposition long enough that the distinction had become genuinely unclear to her. I started making calls. I spoke with Tom Kowalski, who turned out to have received 11 citations in the past 2 years for offenses including an improperly stored garden hose and a wind chime that Sandra had determined created unreasonable acoustic disruption. I talked to Marcus Washington, who had been fined for his son's bicycle being visible from the street and had paid $600 in accumulated fines rather than deal with the escalating harassment. I knocked on doors and had quiet conversations over back fences and gradually assembled a picture of what Sandra Whitfield had been doing to this neighborhood for 6 years. The pattern was methodical and deliberate. Long-time residents, people who'd lived here for decades, who had strong roots and strong attachments and therefore strong resistance to leaving, were hit with cascading violations, impossible standards, escalating fines, and the quiet but unmistakable implication that compliance was impossible and departure was the only alternative. New residents who fit Sandra's vision were welcomed warmly and cited for almost nothing. The Hendersons, who'd lived on Maple Court for 28 years, had sold 18 months ago after a campaign of harassment that Mrs. Henderson described to me, through tears, as the most stressful experience of her life outside of her husband's cancer treatment. The property had been purchased at a notably below market price by a development company called Eastview Residential Partners. I wrote down that name. It would become important later. Knowledge nugget for anyone watching who might be dealing with something similar. HOA boards cannot legally create new rules and retroactively apply them to existing structures without formal notice, a resident vote meeting quorum requirements, and documentation filed with the county. Any violation notice based on a rule that didn't exist when your structure was built is legally challengeable. Always request a copy of the original recorded covenants from your county clerk's office, not from the HOA itself. The county copy is the legally binding document. The HOA's copy may or may not reflect what was actually recorded. I requested the original recorded covenants. What I found when Betty Simmons, the county clerk who had known my grandfather and who treated the records room like her personal cathedral of truth, spread the documents across her counter, was that Sandra Whitfield had been issuing violations based on rules that existed nowhere in the legally binding HOA documents. She had been operating an entirely parallel system of invented regulations, counting on residents being too intimidated, too busy, or too trusting to check. The cedar fence Big Will built in 1987 was not only compliant with the original covenants, it was specifically referenced as an example of appropriate boundary construction in a 1991 amendment. My truck was not a commercial vehicle under any reasonable definition in the recorded documents. My flagpole was 4 inches below the maximum height explicitly permitted. My front door was a color that had been approved in writing 30 years before Sandra Whitfield had ever heard of Maplewood Estates. Every single violation notice Sandra had sent me was fraudulent. I sat in Betty's records room for a long time after that, the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the smell of old paper surrounding me, and I thought about Big Will's hand in mine and his voice saying, "Stand your ground," and I made some decisions about how the next chapter of this story was going to go. The first thing I did when I got home was call my old Army buddy Congressman Terrence Webb, who now sat on the House Subcommittee on Housing and Community Development and who owed me a favor from an incident in Fallujah in 2005 that we had both agreed never to discuss in detail. I didn't ask for anything dramatic. I just asked him to point me toward the right people to talk to about systematic HOA fraud. He gave me 3 names. The third name was Assistant District Attorney Patricia Chen, who specialized in financial crimes and who, as it turned out, had already opened a preliminary inquiry into Maplewood Estates HOA based on complaints from 2 former residents. The second thing I did was install 3 security cameras covering my property from every angle. Military grade, motion activated, cloud-backed storage. The kind of system that doesn't miss anything and doesn't lose footage conveniently. The third thing I did was wait, because 26 years in the Army teaches you that patience isn't passive. Patience is active. Preparation for the moment your opponent makes the mistake you've been expecting them to make. Sandra made her first serious mistake 3 weeks later when she organized what she called a community standards inspection walk, which was essentially Sandra and 2 HOA board members marching through the neighborhood photographing properties they intended to cite. They came to my driveway at 8:30 in the morning without notice, without invitation, and without any legal authority to be on my private property, which my cameras recorded in perfect high definition from 3 angles simultaneously. I came out onto my porch and watched them. I didn't say anything. I just watched. Sandra met my eyes and held them for a moment, and something passed between us that both of us understood clearly. She knew I wasn't going to fold, and I knew she wasn't going to stop, and we both understood that this was therefore going to end badly for one of us. She sent 7 violation notices the next day. A. Personal record. I forwarded them all to Patricia Chen with a cover note that said simply, "Adding to the file." Sandra's husband David made his contribution to the disaster 2 weeks after that when he used his city council position to push through an emergency ordinance expanding HOA enforcement authority in Maplewood Estates. It was the kind of procedural maneuver that looks routine on paper and is devastating in practice. The sort of thing a city councilman can do when he has enough allies on the council and enough confidence that nobody is paying close attention. The ordinance essentially gave the Maplewood Estates HOA quasi-governmental enforcement powers, including the ability to place liens on properties for unpaid fines without going through normal court procedures. What David didn't know was that Patricia Chen had been quietly building a case for 8 weeks at that point, and his council vote recorded, documented, with his financial connections to Eastview Residential. Partners now clearly established through property records had just transformed her financial crimes investigation into something with much more interesting dimensions. When an elected official uses public office to benefit a private entity in which he has undisclosed financial interests, he is acting in a dual role as both an elected official and a private entity. The word for that isn't corruption in the abstract sense. The word for that in federal statute is a specific crime with a specific sentencing range. I found out about the ordinance from Marcus Washington, who called me at 7 a.m. sounding like a man who had not slept. "James," he said, "they just gave themselves the power to put a lien on my house if I don't pay those bicycle fines. Andre's bicycle fines. My kid's bicycle." There was something in Marcus's voice that I recognized from the field, the sound of a good person who has been pushed past the point where patience feels like virtue and starts to feel like surrender. "Marcus," I said, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to write down everything that has happened to you since Sandra Whitfield became HOA president. Dates, amounts, the exact wording of every notice, how you felt when you received them, what you said, what they said, everything. Can you do that?" He said he could. I gave him Patricia Chen's secure email address. Over the next 10 days I made the same call to 11 different neighbors. Each of them had a story. Each story fit the same pattern. and each of them sent their documentation to Patricia Chen, who called me after the 8th submission and said, with the careful, controlled excitement of a prosecutor who has just watched a case transform itself from interesting to exceptional, Colonel Harrison, "I think you need to come in and talk to me in person." What Patricia laid out in her conference room that afternoon was a scheme of considerably larger ambition than I had initially understood. Sandra and David Whitfield, working in coordination with Eastview Residential Partners, had been systematically engineering the departure of long-time residents from Maplewood Estates for 6 years. The harassment campaigns served a dual purpose. They drove residents out and they drove property values down, because a neighborhood with a reputation for oppressive HOA enforcement attracts fewer buyers and inspires lower offers from the ones it does attract. Eastview had then purchased departing residents' properties at suppressed prices through a network of shell companies that kept the connection to David Whitfield obscured, but not, it turned out, obscured quite well enough for a forensic accountant with the right subpoenas. The plan, as Patricia explained it with the assistance of a whiteboard and what appeared to be genuinely righteous fury, was to eventually acquire enough properties in Maplewood Estates to reach a threshold that would allow Eastview to petition for rezoning of the entire area for mixed-use commercial development. The remaining long-time residents people like Tom Kowalski and Eleanor Patterson and Marcus Washington and me would then be subject to compulsory purchase proceedings in which their below-market property values, artificially suppressed by 6 years of HOA harassment, would be used to calculate the compensation they received for losing homes their families had lived in for generations. Big Will's house, the kitchen where my grandmother made biscuits, the garage where I first learned to use a wrench, the flagpole that had been flying since the day Kennedy was shot. All of it valued at a fraction of its real worth because Sandra Whitfield had spent 6 years making the neighborhood look like a place people wanted to leave. I sat in Patricia's conference room for a long time after she finished. The air tasted like burnt coffee and the particular bitterness of understanding something clearly for the first time. Then I asked Patricia one question. "What do you need from me?" She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has been waiting a long time to answer exactly that question. "I need Sandra Whitfield to keep being exactly who she is," Patricia said, "and I need you to keep being exactly where you are when she does it." 2 days later, Patricia introduced me to Sheriff Raymond Cole. He was a compact, deliberate man with the economy of movement that develops in people who have spent decades being precise about physical situations. He shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and said, "I've been wanting to do something about the Whitfields for 4 years. Tell me what you need." We talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, we had an understanding and a plan, and a date circled on a calendar that both of us were looking forward to, with the focused anticipation of professionals preparing for a clean, well-executed operation. Sandra, meanwhile, had escalated to a campaign of personal intimidation that she clearly believed was her strongest strategic move. She began parking her Range Rover across the street from my house for extended periods, watching. She organized a neighborhood petition which turned out to contain several signatures of people who told me privately they had signed under significant social pressure and hadn't understood what they were agreeing to, calling for the removal of my commercial vehicle and associated equipment. She filed a complaint with the county about my security cameras, alleging they violated residents' privacy, which was a creative argument that collapsed immediately upon anyone noting that they were pointed exclusively at my own property. She also began spreading stories through the neighborhood's social media groups, carefully phrased, always with plausible deniability, concerns about a neighbor's adjustment to civilian life, observations about changes in behavior that might warrant professional attention. The language of community concern weaponized against a man whose only offense was refusing to comply with fraudulent regulations. It was a sophisticated and genuinely ugly piece of social engineering, and it told me more about Sandra Whitfield's character than anything else she had done. Eleanor Patterson, God bless her, became my most valuable intelligence asset. 81 years old, sharp as a bayonet, with a network of neighborhood relationships that made her social information flow roughly equivalent to a well-placed intelligence operative. She knew who was being pressured, who was wavering, who was angry enough to testify, and crucially she knew Sandra's schedule, her habits, and the particular rhythm of her escalations. It was Eleanor who told me 3 days before it happened that Sandra was planning something for that Wednesday morning. She's been on her phone constantly, Eleanor said over tea, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for justice for a very long time. She's telling people she's going to settle things with you personally. I don't know exactly what she means, but I know it. Won't be reasonable. I called Sheriff Cole that evening. Wednesday morning, I said. He said, I'll be there. I called Patricia Chen. She said, make sure every camera is charged. I went to bed that night thinking about Big Will and his firm grip and his certainty that standing your ground was not just a right but an obligation. Slept better than I had in months. Wednesday morning arrived cool and clear, the particular crystalline quality of early September air that makes everything look slightly more defined than usual, edges sharpened, colors precise. I was on my front porch at 8:30 with coffee when Sandra's Range Rover turned onto my street at a speed that suggested this was not a casual visit. She parked at an angle that managed to convey aggression purely through geometry and got out wearing that cobalt blue blazer, the most aggressive one, and the expression of a woman who has convinced herself that what she is about to do is not just justified, but righteous. Sheriff Cole was in my kitchen. He had arrived at 8:15, parked his personal vehicle 2 streets over, and entered through the back gate with the quiet efficiency of a man who has executed a lot of operations and understands that preparation is the work and execution is just the delivery. Patricia Chen was 3 blocks away in an unmarked vehicle with 2 of her investigators and a recording device that had been running since 8 a.m. My 3 cameras were recording. Eleanor Patterson was at her front window with her coffee and the expression of a woman who has earned the right to watch this. Sandra came up my driveway like she owned it, which was of course the central delusion of everything she had done for 6 years. She was talking before she was fully through my front gate, a practice stream of violation language and community standards and the HOA's legal authority that she had clearly rehearsed, probably multiple times, in the Range Rover on the way over. Behind her, 2 HOA board members, trailed with clipboards, looking simultaneously important and deeply uncertain about their life choices. I let her talk. I stood on my porch with my coffee, and my 26 years of practice at not giving people the reaction they're looking for, and I let her finish her prepared remarks. Then I said, quietly and without particular heat, Sandra, every violation you have ever sent me is based on rules that don't exist in the recorded HOA covenants. I have documentation proving this. I have shared it with the district attorney's office. I think you should go home. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds and will probably be the most consequential 4 seconds of Sandra Whitfield's life. Something shifted in her expression. The rehearsed authority collapsed into something rawer and more honest, which was rage and panic wearing each other's clothes. She came up the 2 porch steps in a motion that was less walking and more lunging, and she raised her right hand and she slapped me across the left cheek with enough force to make the sound carry clearly across the quiet street. The cameras caught all of it. The approach, the motion, the contact, the sound, 3 angles, perfect clarity, irrefutable and complete. I didn't move. I had been trained in various ways and by various people over 26 years not to react to things on instinct when reaction would be strategically counterproductive. I stood where I was and I felt the sting and I heard the birds scatter from Big Will's oak tree and I waited. Ma'am! Sheriff Cole's voice from behind me was so calm it was almost gentle. Please put your hands behind your back. Sandra's face went through 5 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. Shock at the voice, confusion at the location of the voice, recognition of who the voice belonged to, understanding of what recognition meant, and then the specific expression that crosses a person's face when they realize they have been operating on false assumptions for so long that reality has become unrecognizable and is now, consequence in hand, standing on their doorstep. The board members with the clipboards had taken several steps backward. One of them had dropped her clipboard. Neither of them said anything. There was really nothing to say. I'm the HOA president, Sandra said, and her voice had lost its rehearsed authority and was now just a person's voice, bewildered and frightened and small. I have legal authority over community standards enforcement. You have the right to remain silent, Sheriff Cole said, moving forward with the handcuffs, and I would strongly recommend exercising it. The click of the handcuffs was the sound of a promise kept. Not the promise Sandra thought she was keeping when she got out of that Range Rover. Big Will's promise. The one about standing your ground. The one about not letting anyone take what's yours with money or paper or fancy words. The one that turned out, in the end, to require exactly what it said. Standing your ground. Patricia Chen's car was pulling up to the curb before the handcuffs were fully secured. The board members had retreated to the sidewalk and were making phone calls with the frantic energy of people trying to reach lawyers before anyone reached them. Eleanor Patterson was watching from across the street with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is finding the reality of it every bit as satisfying as she had imagined. I stood on my grandfather's porch, in front of my grandfather's flag, and I watched Sandra Whitfield walk down my grandfather's driveway in handcuffs, and I drank my coffee, which had gone slightly cold. And I thought about how some promises take longer to keep than you expected, and how the keeping of them is worth every single minute of the wait. That was the beginning. What came after the investigation, the charges, the courtroom, the reckoning, that's where this story really lives. And I'm going to tell you all of it. David Whitfield found out his wife had been arrested while he was in a city council budget meeting, which is the kind of irony that would be satisfying even if everything else hadn't been satisfying, which it was. His phone buzzed, he looked at it, and the other council members later described watching the color leave his face in a way that suggested the news was not entirely surprising to him. He excused himself from the meeting, walked to his car, and made 4 phone calls in the parking lot. All of which were to lawyers and all of which were recorded by the federal wiretap that Patricia Chen's team had obtained 17 days earlier based on evidence gathered from the HOA financial records. The financial records were where the real story lived. Sandra had been president, treasurer, and effectively the sole financial officer of the Maplewood Estates HOA for 6 years, which in retrospect was a governance structure that should have concerned everyone. Had concerned no one because Sandra had made questioning her authority a socially costly activity. Betty Simmons at the county clerk's office had noticed 18 months earlier that the HOA's annual financial filings had become increasingly vague and then had stopped entirely, a fact she had flagged in an internal memo that had sat unread in a county administrator's inbox until Patricia Chen's investigators went looking for it. What the financial records showed, once Patricia's forensic accountant had spent 3 weeks with them, was a diversion of community funds so systematic and so brazen that it crossed a certain line, from financial mismanagement into something that required considerably more serious vocabulary. Over 6 years, approximately $430,000 in HOA fees and special assessments had moved through accounts controlled by Sandra into accounts connected to entities connected to David, specifically into the operational structure of Eastview. Residential partners, specifically into the portion of Eastview's operation that was purchasing distressed properties in Maplewood Estates at below-market prices. Knowledge nugget. When HOA funds are diverted to benefit individuals connected to the board, it constitutes embezzlement. When that embezzlement involves financial instruments crossing state lines, which in this case it did because Eastview maintained accounts in 2 states, it becomes federal wire fraud. When it's part of a coordinated scheme involving a public official using his office to facilitate the fraud, the relevant federal statute is the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which carries sentences of up to 20 years and allows for the forfeiture of assets acquired through the criminal enterprise. This is not HOA drama anymore. This is organized crime. Patricia Chen filed charges on a Thursday. The charges named Sandra Whitfield, David Whitfield, and 3 officers of Eastview Residential Partners. The list of charges was long enough that reading it aloud in the arraignment took 11 minutes, which I know because I was there, sitting in the 3rd row next to Tom Kowalski and Marcus Washington, and Tom had quietly timed it on his watch and shown me the face with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Sandra's lawyer entered a not guilty plea with the confidence of someone who had not yet fully reviewed the evidence. That confidence was noticeably absent 3 weeks later when Patricia's team delivered 17 boxes of documentation to the defense table, at which point Sandra's lawyer requested a meeting with the prosecutors, which is the legal system's version of raising a white flag while insisting you're just asking for directions. The plea negotiation took 6 weeks. Sandra pleaded guilty to embezzlement, wire fraud, and assault, the last charge being technically the slap, which under the circumstances felt almost quaint compared to everything else, but which was real, documented, and which Sandra had, after all, committed in front of the county sheriff. David pleaded guilty to conspiracy and abuse of public office. The Eastview officers pleaded to various financial crimes charges with cooperation agreements that substantially reduced their sentences in exchange for testimony and documentation that filled in several gaps in the prosecution's understanding of the scheme's scope. The sentencing was on a November morning, cold and grey, the kind of day that feels like punctuation. The courtroom was full. Eleanor Patterson was in the second row, 90 minutes early, having apparently been unwilling to risk not getting a seat. The Hendersons had driven back from the city where they'd relocated after being driven out of Maplewood Estates, a 4-hour round trip they had clearly considered worth making. Marcus Washington was there with his wife Diane and his son Andre, who was wearing a tie and sitting very straight and watching everything with those quiet, absorbing eyes that reminded me so much of a younger version of myself. Judge Carol Morrison had the kind of face that communicates an extensive and categorical intolerance for the wasting of her time or anyone else's. She sentenced Sandra to 4 years in federal prison with mandatory restitution of all diverted HOA funds plus civil penalties. She sentenced David to 5 years, one more than his wife, specifically because his abuse of public office represented what the judge called a fundamental betrayal of the trust democratic governance requires, and she said it with the particular emphasis of someone who wanted those words in the transcript. The Eastview officers received sentences ranging from 2 to 3 years, depending on their cooperation and the specific nature of their involvement. Before she delivered the sentences, Judge Morrison addressed the courtroom directly. She spoke about Maplewood Estates, which she had clearly researched beyond what was required for the immediate proceedings. She spoke about the families who had been driven from homes they had lived in for decades, the community relationships that had been poisoned, the trust that had been systematically exploited by people who had confused authority with ownership and power with right. She said that the law exists to protect communities like Maplewood Estates from people like the Whitfields, and that when the law works as it should, this is what it looks like, and that she hoped everyone in the courtroom, regardless of which side of the matter they had been on, would take that clarity home with them. I took it home to Big Will's porch, to the flag on its steel pole, to the coffee that was the right temperature because I'd had time to drink it at my own pace on my own porch without anyone coming up the driveway with fraudulent violations and manufactured rage. The neighborhood's recovery was not immediate because real damage takes real time to repair, and what Sandra had done to Maplewood Estates over 6 years was real damage. Trust doesn't reconstitute itself the moment the handcuffs click. People who had learned to be afraid don't simply stop being afraid because the specific thing they were afraid of has been removed. The social fabric that Sandra had systematically torn had to be rewoven, one conversation, one shared meal, one honest exchange at a time. We started with a neighborhood meeting in Eleanor Patterson's backyard, which Eleanor organized with the authority of a woman who has spent 80 years watching communities either care for themselves or fail to do so, and has strong opinions about which outcome she prefers. About 40 people came. We talked, honestly and for a long time, about what had happened and what it had cost and what we wanted the neighborhood to be. Several people cried. Several people apologized for things they had done during Sandra's tenure under social pressure they now felt ashamed of. Several people expressed anger at Sandra, at David, at themselves for not organizing sooner, and the expression of that anger was itself a kind of relief, a pressure valve releasing something that had been building for years. We formed a new HOA governance structure with term limits, mandatory independent financial audits, resident override mechanisms for board decisions, and a formal complaint process for HOA actions that residents believed were retaliatory or fraudulent. Marcus Washington became the new president, elected by a margin that suggested the neighborhood's feelings about having him in charge were both enthusiastic and unanimous. Tom Kowalski volunteered as treasurer. And his 43 years of meticulous personal financial management proved to be exactly the right preparation for the role. The Hendersons didn't come back. Their new life in the city had taken root, and their daughter lived nearby, and the practical geometry of their situation had shifted in ways that made return unlikely. But they came to Eleanor's backyard meeting, and before they left, Mrs. Henderson found me near the garden fence and told me something I have thought about many times since. "We knew something was wrong," she said. "We just didn't know how to fight it. Watching you fight it that mattered. It matters even now, even to us, even though we're not coming back. It matters that it was fought." Eastview's properties in Maplewood Estates were subject to federal forfeiture proceedings as assets of the criminal enterprise. The properties were eventually sold through a court-supervised process at fair market value, with proceeds going first to the restitution fund for defrauded residents and the remainder to a community improvement trust administered by the new HOA board. 3 of the properties were purchased by families with multi-generational ties to the neighborhood who had been priced out. During the harassment years, and now, with the artificial price suppression removed, found the genuine market value accessible. Patricia Chen filed an amicus brief in a case before the state appeals court that resulted in new guidance on HOA financial disclosure requirements and resident rights of oversight. She mentioned Maplewood Estates in the brief by name and specifically noted the role of resident documentation in building the prosecution's case. A state legislator who read the brief introduced a bill which passed in the following session requiring annual independent audits of HOAs over a certain size and establishing criminal penalties for HOA officials who knowingly issue fraudulent violation notices. I testified before the State Housing Committee in support of the bill, wearing my uniform for the first and only time since retiring because I thought the occasion warranted it. The committee chair, who had apparently not been told I was coming in uniform, looked slightly taken aback and then composed himself and thanked me for my service in a way that suggested he was now paying very close attention to everything I was about to say. I told them about Big Will's house and Big Will's fence and the flag that had been flying since Kennedy and cedar boards that Big Will cut and fitted by hand in 1987, and what it had meant to know that all of it was at risk because someone had decided that her aesthetic preferences outweighed 60 years of a family's investment in a community. The bill is called the Community Protection and HOA Accountability Act. It doesn't have my name on it, which is fine. Big Will's name isn't on it either, but in a way that I find more meaningful than any formal dedication, the part of the bill specifically protecting veteran-owned properties from retaliatory HOA actions was written in direct response to testimony provided by Marcus Washington about what had happened to him, and Marcus told me afterward that when he wrote that testimony, he thought specifically about the look on Andre's face the day he told his son the bicycle fine had been paid. Sometimes justice looks like a gavel and a sentence. Sometimes it looks like a teenager's bicycle leaning against a porch railing without anyone threatening to fine it. 18 months after Sandra Whitfield was led down my grandfather's driveway in handcuffs, I was sitting on Big Will's porch on a warm May evening with a glass of sweet tea, watching the flag move slightly in the last of the afternoon breeze. Tom and Rita Kowalski were in their garden next door, arguing cheerfully about where to plant the tomatoes, which is the same argument Eleanor Patterson tells me they have had every spring for 42 consecutive years. Marcus Washington's son Andre was shooting hoops in the driveway with 2 friends, the sound of the ball on asphalt carrying cleanly through the warm air. Eleanor was on her porch, as she is most evenings, reading something with the focused attention of a woman who has not yet read everything she intends to read and is aware that she needs to maintain her pace. The neighborhood sounded like a neighborhood again. Not like a place under occupation. Not like somewhere people were calculating their options and measuring their exposure and wondering who had reported them this time. It sounded like the neighborhood it had been for 60 years before Sandra Whitfield arrived with her Range Rover and her fabricated rules and her certainty that other people's lives were hers to manage. I thought about Big Will. I thought about his hands and his voice and the $11,000 he saved to buy this house and the flag he raised on the worst day in recent American history because he believed the country needed it. I thought about the promise I'd made him and what it had required and what it had cost and what it had been worth. All of it, I thought. Every bit of it. The flag moved in the evening breeze and the basketball bounced off the driveway, and Tom and Rita Kowalski reached their annual compromise about the tomatoes, which apparently always involves Rita being right, and Eleanor Patterson turned a page, and the neighborhood breathed the easy and unremarkable breath of a community that has been through something difficult and come out knowing itself better than it did before. Stand your ground, do it the right way. Big Will knew what he was talking about. Drop a comment below, sharing your own story, because Maplewood Estates isn't unique, and the people who fought back here want you to know that you're not alone, and that the fight is winnable when you document everything, find your allies. And trust that the law, when properly applied, is still a powerful instrument in the hands of people who deserve it. Hit subscribe if you believe that communities are worth protecting and that the people who try to steal them for profit should answer for it. Next week, I'm going to tell you about the city zoning board that tried to condemn a veterans workshop and the three-generation family secret hidden in the foundation walls that changed everything. Justice, when it comes like water finding its way home. Steadily, inevitably, and right where it belongs.